Welcome back to American TimeVault. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most complex and divisive conflicts in modern history, the Vietnam War. For many, it's a name that brings up images of jungle warfare, helicopters, and protest signs. But what really happened? Why did America get involved in a small Southeast Asian country thousands of miles away? And why is it still called America's longest war? Let's travel back in time to find the answers. Our story begins not in the 1960s, but decades earlier. For nearly a century, Vietnam was under French colonial rule. After World War II, a powerful wave of nationalism swept the globe, and Vietnam was no exception. A charismatic leader named Ho Chi Minh, inspired by both communism and American ideals of declared Vietnam's independence in 1945. He even quoted the U.S. Declaration of Independence in his speech. But France wasn't ready to let go of its colony, leading to the First Indochina War. The United States, caught in the early days of the Cold War, faced a difficult choice. On one hand, it supported decolonization. On the other, it feared the spread of communism, the so-called domino theory. This theory suggested that if one country in a region fell to communism, the surrounding countries would follow like a row of falling dominoes. Fearing a communist Vietnam would threaten all of Southeast Asia, President Truman, and later Eisenhower, decided to support the French, sending money and military aid. Despite American help, the French were defeated in 1954 at the pivotal Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The subsequent Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, became a communist state. The South, led by the anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem, was supported by the United States. The plan was to hold nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but the U.S. and South Vietnam, fearing a certain victory for Ho Chi Minh, refused to hold the elections. The temporary division became a permanent, heavily armed border. This decision set the stage for a new conflict. In the South, Diem's government was corrupt and oppressive, alienating much of the population, especially the Buddhist majority. Opposition grew, and a communist-backed guerrilla force known as the Viet Cong began to gain strength. They used hit-and-run tactics, blending in with the local population, making them an elusive and formidable enemy. In response, the United States deepened its involvement. Under President John F. Kennedy, the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam grew from a few hundred to over 16,000. Their official role was to train the South Vietnamese army, but they were increasingly drawn into combat. The situation was deteriorating, and the U.S. felt trapped. Supporting Diem was problematic, but abandoning South Vietnam felt like surrendering to communism. The major turning point came in August 1964. An incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, involving alleged attacks on U.S. destroyers by North Vietnamese patrol boats, provided President Lyndon B. Johnson with the justification he needed to escalate the war. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting Johnson broad powers to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The advisory role was over. In March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops 3 Marines landed at Da Nang. It was the beginning of a massive military buildup. By 1968, over 500,000 American soldiers were on the ground in Vietnam. The U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. On T, ground troops engaged in search and destroy missions, trying to root out the Viet Cong from the dense jungles and rural villages. The fighting was brutal and unlike any war America had fought before. There were no clear front lines. The enemy was often indistinguishable from civilians. Soldiers battled not only a determined foe, but also the oppressive heat, monsoons, and unfamiliar terrain filled with booby traps and ambushes. The psychological toll was immense. The primary measure of success wasn't territory gained, but a grim statistic: the body count. Back home, the war was tearing America apart. At first, many supported the effort. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, public opinion shifted dramatically. The Vietnam War was the first television war nightly news broadcasts brought the brutal reality of combat into American living rooms, showing scenes that contradicted the government's optimistic reports. A credibility gap grew between what officials were saying and what people were seeing. A powerful anti-war movement emerged, centered on college campuses, but soon spreading across the country. Protesters argued the war was immoral, unwinnable, and a drain on resources that could be used to address problems at home. The draft, which sent thousands of young men to fight, became a major point of contention. The nation was deeply divided between hawks who supported the war and doves who opposed it. The year 1968 was a watershed moment. In January, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong launched the TAT offensive, a massive, coordinated surprise attack on cities and military bases throughout South Vietnam. Militarily, it was a failure for the communists, who suffered heavy losses and failed to hold any territory. But psychologically, it was a stunning blow to the United States. The attack, especially the fighting at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, proved that no part of South Vietnam was safe and that the enemy was far from defeated. Public support for the war plummeted. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, famously declared the war a stalemate. President Johnson, facing immense pressure, announced he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 with the promise of peace with honor. His strategy was Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while building up the South Vietnamese military to fight the war on its own. While peace talks began in Paris, Nixon also secretly expanded the war, ordering the bombing of Viet Cong supply lines in neighboring Cambodia. This secret expansion, when revealed, sparked even more outrage and protests, leading to tragic events like the Kent State shootings in 1970, where National Guardsmen killed 4 student protesters. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the return of American prisoners of war. For the United States, the war was over. The last American combat troops left Vietnam 2 months later. But for the Vietnamese, the fighting continued. Without American support, the South Vietnamese army struggled to hold back the North. In the spring of 1975, the North launched a final, massive offensive. The South's defenses collapsed with stunning speed. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The world watched dramatic footage of helicopters evacuating the last Americans and desperate South Vietnamese from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. The war was finally over. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The legacy of the Vietnam War is profound and lasting. It cost the lives of over 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians. It left veterans with deep physical and psychological scars, and many returned home not to parades, but to a nation that was indifferent or even hostile. The war shattered the myth of American invincibility and led to widespread distrust of the government. It also led to the War Powers Act of 1973, an attempt by Congress to limit a president's ability to wage war without its approval. The Vietnam War was a tragedy born from a complex mix of Cold War fears, misguided policies, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Vietnamese history and nationalism. It serves as a powerful reminder of the human costs of conflict and the complex consequences of foreign intervention. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a pivotal chapter in American history. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to American TimeVault for more deep dives into the past. Let us know in the comments what topic you'd like us to explore next. Until then, keep questioning history.